The music printing technology and commerce crossed the ocean with the English settlers in America and found a fertile land where it would grow to proportions never imagined or possible in the Old World. Music making and music publications were part of that society as well from the very beginning. In the second half of the 1600s and well into the 1700s, every boat bound to America carried a printed copy or two of the English folk songs and dances collection called the English Dancing Master, published in its first of 18 editions in 1651 by London's John Playford, a legendary music publisher who dominated the music publishing in London at the time and who is a forerunner and a precursor of John Walsh's dominance in the field that we spoke about earlier, Handel's publisher, remember? By the late 1600s, led by the knowledge and experience acquired back in England, the settlers in America have set up their own printing and publishing shops that could print music as well. And the first American publication of printed music saw the light of day. The 1698 edition of the Bay Sound Book, containing 13 compositions in 2 vocal parts. Now, the first American publication of the American-born music author was printed and distributed 60 years later in 1759. It was a song by Francis Hopkinson called "My Days Have Been So Wondrous Free." Incidentally, Hopkinson is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the designer of the first American flag. Now, that's some honorable and distinguished gene in the American printing and publishing DNA now, isn't it? Together with the printing and publishing trade, the copyright ideas traveled across the ocean as well. And the regulations of the Queen Anne's 1710 statute on copyright found its way into the United States Constitution in 1790, including its 14-year long term of the copyright protection, remember? As in the statute of Queen Anne, the United States original copyright law did not mention music. But just like was the case in England, the power and the reach of music composing, printing, and commerce asserted itself onto the law, and the United States legal code eventually recognized music as legitimately copyrightable work in 1831, bringing its copyright owners all the relevant rights and privileges. That is, all the relevant rights and privileges regarding music printing and publishing, but what of the rights for the countless public performances of the musical works? These rights didn't become part of the copyright law in the United States until 1856, when they were applied only to the so-called dramatic musical performances like operas and operettas of the time. It wasn't until 1897 that all the musical works were protected by the public performance rights in the United States, and even then, like in England, those rights were not effectively enforced and were largely neglected. See, regardless of the copyright law, the authors of the musical works were not being compensated for the public performances of their works at all. Unless if they perhaps personally participated in a performance, in which case they might be paid as performers, but not as the authors. The country that first legally instituted effective enforcement mechanism for the performance rights in musical works was France. And of course, being France, it all started in a cafe. So reportedly, on Friday evening, May 7, 1847, French composer Ernest Bourget demonstratively refused to pay his bill in a cafe in Paris because he heard his music being performed by the musicians there and he has not been compensated for the performance as the author. Another account of the incident reports that Bourget was actually refused a service in the cafe that evening because he only ordered a glass of sugar water, which in turn caused him to threaten the owner, Mr. Morel, with forbidding him to use Bourget's music for the live performances there since he wasn't properly paid for it. Anyway, very dramatic, very scandalous, and oh so very French. Either way, a very public and bitter litigation followed, Bourget versus Morel, which ultimately resulted in the verdict against Morel, where he was ordered to pay Bourget 500 francs for the performance rights of the Bourget's music performed in his cafe. Now, at that time, 500 francs could buy 1,000 gallons of red wine. Now, that's the most expensive refused glass of sugar water ever. But more importantly, see, the verdict prompted the establishment of the first official National Music Performance Rights Society in 1851, which was established in order to administer, collect, and distribute the performance rights royalties like those originally withheld by Morel on behalf of the French composers and publishers, and which has greatly influenced the music business until this day, not only in France, but internationally as well. By 1910, this society was collecting over 4 million francs annually for its members, which is almost $20 million in today's value. The French Society of Music Authors, Composers and Publishers, as it is called, still represents French composers and publishers today, and is thus the oldest performance rights society in the world, the one that the performance rights societies in England and America were modeled on more than half a century later. The first American Performance Rights Society, ASCAP, was formed in 1914 in order to enforce the performance rights of the music copyright owners and to bridge the gap between the law and the practice in that regard in the United States. As we mentioned earlier, though the musical works were protected by the public performance rights in the United States since 1897, those rights were not effectively enforced at all and were largely neglected. The leading music publishers in the States have, by the turn of the century, gained enough power and notoriety that they decided to take matters into their own hands and form their own performance rights society like the one in France in order to enforce the performance rights legislation. American Society of Composers, Authors and Publishers, or ASCAP, was founded on February 13, 1914. And incidentally, like with the one in France, it all began with the composer Victor Herbert this time, hearing his music performed in a restaurant in New York City without compensation to him as the author. ASCAP very quickly became a major force in the music industry in the United States, a crucial arm of the music business, lobbying and petitioning the government on behalf of its members, controlling and managing the performance rights market, litigating performance rights cases, and maintaining vigilance on the new media and communication technologies that utilized music content copyrighted by its members. Movies, radio, television, cable, satellite, and now internet are all new technological and communication fields that developed since the foundation of ASCAP, where ASCAP has led the way for the new relevant performance rights legislations and appropriate compensation for the composers and publishers whose works became an integral part of those new fields. Now, one of the battles that ASCAP fought in the past in that area resulted actually in the foundation of another competing performance rights organization in the United States, still active today, Broadcast Music Incorporated, or BMI. See, in 1939, the radio broadcasters, deeming ASCAP's royalties too high, took all the music written by the ASCAP composers off the air, created their own performance rights organization, BMI, and started broadcasting only music not licensed by ASCAP while signing the composers and publishers of that music to their new organization. At the time, that was mostly country and rhythm and blues, the genres outside of the mainstream, but the genres that, in addition to their own rise in popularity, will eventually lead to the tide of rock and roll that could not be stopped, and which, led by the indie labels and the indie radio stations of the time, flooded the market and made BMI a force to reckon with to this very day. Now, the third performance rights organization in the United States, still active today, was founded before BMI in 1930, but originally represented only the European classical music publishers administering and collecting their members' performance rights royalties in the United States, thus the name the Society of European Stage Authors and Composers, or SESAC. Eventually, SESAC modified its role and started acquiring American catalogs by signing American publishers, at first in the underrepresented genres like gospel, and later on across the musical spectrum.